Hey everyone, I'm glad you're back, and I hope you all have a fantastic day. Today, I've got a few satisfying revenge stories for us. So get comfortable, and let's get straight into the first one. Let's start with someone who seriously underestimated the woman he'd been cheating on. This first post is from r/pettyrevenge subreddit and is called "He Didn't Believe That I Would Do Anything When I Found Out He Was Cheating." After more than 10 years together, he finally admitted what he'd done and apparently assumed that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The woman who wrote this had been with the same man for more than a decade. Looking back, she says he never deserved the loyalty she gave him, but for a long time, she stayed committed to the relationship. Then, a few days before writing the post, things became bad enough that she finally confronted him. She told him that she already knew he was cheating. Then she began listing the details she had managed to confirm, one piece at a time. At first, he tried to stay quiet, but once she presented enough information that he couldn't reasonably deny it anymore, he lowered his head and admitted everything. And according to her, this wasn't one isolated mistake. He admitted that he had never really been loyal to her, not at the end of the relationship, not during one difficult period, but from the very beginning. After more than 10 years of trusting him, she suddenly realized that the entire relationship had been built around lies she'd never been allowed to see. She was furious, not only because of the cheating, but because of the manipulation and mistreatment she says had happened throughout the relationship. So she opened Facebook and began writing. She described the lies, the cheating, and the patterns she had finally started putting together. Her goal wasn't only to embarrass him. She says she wanted to warn other women about the kind of person he was, especially because he had been involved with people throughout the same social circle. She contacted husbands, boyfriends, and friends connected to the women she knew about so they could make their own decisions with the full story. And apparently, nobody had been considered off limits. She discovered that he had even been involved with his own brother's girlfriend, which is one of those details that makes you stop and think, okay, how many relationships was this man trying to destroy at the same time? But the Facebook post wasn't spreading as widely as she had hoped. She had written everything out, but she wasn't very familiar with how the platform worked or how to reach more people. At that point, this was less about getting revenge and more about making sure the warning didn't disappear after reaching only a handful of friends. While clicking through the page, she ended up on a screen with some kind of form. And then Facebook offered her an option she hadn't expected. For $6, she could turn the post into an advertisement. Facebook would run it for 3 days and show it to a targeted group of people who were likely to interact with it. So that is exactly what she did. For the price of a cheap lunch, she paid Facebook to promote a detailed warning about her cheating ex. Instead of hoping the right people happened to see it, she gave the post its own advertising budget, and somewhere out there, the algorithm was now working to introduce more people to the full story of what he had done. The man had apparently spent years treating her patience and loyalty as weakness. He assumed that because she had tolerated so much before, she would remain quiet when the truth finally came out. What he hadn't expected was for her to document everything, contact the people affected, and then pay to have the warning distributed even further. Okay, so I definitely wasn't expecting the Facebook ad part. There's something almost darkly funny about her sitting there, completely furious, and then Facebook casually asking whether she'd like to promote the post for $6. Like, yes, apparently she would. That may be the most aggressively targeted ad campaign I've ever heard of. Now, posting every detail of a breakup online can obviously become messy very quickly. And I wouldn't say that every cheating situation needs its own sponsored Facebook campaign. But if what she described was accurate, I understand why she felt that the people directly affected deserved to know, especially when some of them were unknowingly in relationships with people involved in the situation. What really gets me is that he apparently thought admitting it was the end of the conversation. After more than a decade of lying, he lowered his head, confessed, and maybe expected her to quietly disappear. Instead, she turned the entire thing into a 3-day advertising campaign. So yeah, he definitely misjudged her. All right, so the first revenge story involved turning a Facebook post into an actual advertisement. This next one is much smaller, at least until the return package arrives. The post is called a box is a box. And it all started with a book that was much, much smaller than advertised. The person telling the story ordered a brand new book on eBay. The price was good. The listing appeared completely normal. And there was nothing suggesting that the book was unusual in any way. But when the package arrived, they immediately noticed something was wrong. The book was tiny. It was less than 1/4 of the size of a normal paperback. The print was extremely small, and the book looked more like a miniature collectible than something intended for comfortable reading. The buyer checked the original listing again. There were no measurements, and nowhere in the description did the seller mention that this was a miniature edition. The seller also wasn't somebody casually getting rid of one old book. He was a professional bookseller and had around 20 more copies of the exact same miniature edition available. Because of that, the buyer found it difficult to believe that he simply hadn't noticed the size. From their perspective, leaving that information out had been deliberate. The buyer also had a progressive eye condition. Even normal print could become difficult to read. So the tiny text inside this book made it practically unusable. They contacted the seller, explained the situation, and said they needed to return it. They also argued that he should cover the return postage since the listing had failed to mention such an obvious and important detail. The seller wasn't apologetic. Instead, he responded by saying that the buyer should have asked what size the book was before ordering it. And according to him, a book is a book, which is technically a sentence. It just isn't a particularly good explanation for selling a miniature book without mentioning that it's miniature. The buyer had already prepared to pay for the return themselves, but the seller eventually offered to arrange a UPS collection at his own expense. He said he would issue the refund after receiving the book, as long as the buyer didn't leave negative feedback. So all the buyer had to do was package it securely and wait for UPS to collect it. Fortunately, they happened to have a box available, a very large box. It had previously contained a chandelier and measured roughly 4 feet by 4 feet. The miniature book would take up almost none of the space inside it. But the seller hadn't said anything about the size of the return package, so the buyer placed the tiny book inside the enormous chandelier box, sealed it up, and let the seller know it was ready for collection. After all, a box is a box. The buyer didn't know exactly how much UPS would charge for transporting a package that large, but oversized shipping is rarely cheap, especially when the person receiving it has agreed to cover the entire bill. So the seller got his miniature book back. It just arrived inside a package large enough to hold a chandelier. Okay, so this is exactly the kind of petty revenge I was hoping for. Nobody was harmed, the book was returned safely, and the only real consequence was that the seller probably had to pay a ridiculous amount to ship a tiny object inside a massive box. And I love that she didn't even need to argue with him again. She just applied his own logic to the return. A book is a book, and apparently a box is a box. I mean, could she have used a smaller package? Of course. Did the 4-foot chandelier box make the situation unnecessarily dramatic? Absolutely. But when someone deliberately leaves out an important detail and then blames you for not asking the exact question they were hoping you wouldn't ask, I understand the temptation. He wanted to be technically correct. She decided to be technically correct too. Also, I found one of the comments under the post pretty funny. It said, "Good things come in small packages. Petty revenge occasionally comes in a gigantic one." And yeah, I don't think anyone is going to summarize this story better than that. Anyways, this next revenge took quite a bit longer and required an entire doctorate. The post is called "Got My Doctorate." It started as a decision made almost entirely out of spite, but eventually became something much more meaningful. The woman telling this story has a stepfather with a pretty large age gap between him and his siblings. Because of that, one of her aunts is roughly the same age as she is. Her aunt went on to earn a PhD in veterinary medicine, which the poster makes clear was a real accomplishment. At the time, the poster had completed a Master of Social Work. That was the degree she needed for her career, and with everything else happening in her life, she wasn't planning to continue any further. Several years later, her grandfather was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. He was a veteran, and as his health declined, he needed help navigating several complicated systems. There were appointments, Medicare, home health services, and different kinds of support that all needed to be coordinated. The poster stepped in to help him through it. She was a veteran herself, so she was already familiar with the Department of Veterans Affairs. And as a social worker with a master's degree, coordinating services and helping people access support was literally part of her professional background. She knew who to contact, what questions to ask, and how to keep different parts of his care working together. It was difficult, but she was able to make the process a little easier for him. During all of this, her aunt repeatedly argued with the grandfather. She believed that because she had doctor in front of her name, she should be the person in charge of the situation. But her doctorate was in veterinary medicine, while the poster was the one with direct experience in social work, veteran services, and coordinating care. More importantly, the aunt was pushing against her own father's wishes and making an already stressful situation harder for him. The conflict wasn't really about whether the aunt was educated. She obviously was. The problem was that she treated her title as proof that her opinion should override everyone else's, including the person whose care they were discussing. The poster was trying to help her grandfather receive the support he actually wanted. Her aunt seemed more interested in proving that she should be the authority in the room. Eventually, after another argument, the poster reached her limit. She turned to her grandfather and said, "You know what? I'm getting my doctorate just to spite her." And her grandfather absolutely loved that idea. He was so proud of her decision that he started telling the entire family. Whenever the subject came up, he would proudly announce that she was going back to school for her doctorate. What may have begun as an angry comment slowly turned into an actual goal, and eventually she followed through. She enrolled in a Doctor of Social Work program. It wasn't a decorative title or an attempt to copy her aunt's career. It was an advanced degree in the same field she had already spent years working in, and the same kind of work that had allowed her to support her grandfather. She kept studying, completed the program, and earned her DSW. But she says the degree itself wasn't her greatest achievement. The most important part was that her grandfather lived long enough to see her graduate. He got to watch her finish something he had been proudly telling everyone about from the beginning. And during the final years of his life, she was still there, using her experience to help care for him. So what began as, "I'm doing this to prove her wrong," became much bigger than the original argument. Yes, she earned the same right to use the title doctor, but she also deepened her knowledge, advanced her career, and gave her grandfather one more reason to feel proud. At that point, upsetting the aunt almost became the least important part of the story. Naturally, people in the comments wanted to know how the aunt reacted. According to the poster, she completely shut her out afterward. Her response was essentially that it was obvious she wasn't wanted or included, so rather than acknowledging the achievement or reflecting on why the family had resisted her involvement, she apparently tried to turn the entire situation back into something being done to her. Okay, I actually really like this one. Getting an entire doctorate purely out of spite would already be an impressive level of commitment, but somewhere along the way, it stopped being only about the aunt. Her grandfather believed in her, bragged about her to everyone, and got to see her graduate. That's the part I think she'll remember much longer than any family argument. And I think there's something kind of funny about the aunt insisting that the person with the title doctor should automatically be in charge, only for the poster to come back with a doctorate of her own. But even then, the poster's strongest argument wasn't the title, you know? It was that she understood the systems they were dealing with. She listened to what her grandfather wanted, and she was actually helping him. A title can show that someone has expertise. It doesn't mean they suddenly have expertise in every subject, or that they get to ignore the wishes of everyone around them. So, yeah, she may have started the doctorate to spite her aunt, but she finished it for herself and for the grandfather who was proud of her from the moment she first said it out loud. That's probably the best kind of revenge. You prove your point and somehow end up building a better life in the process. And I think that's a pretty good place to leave today's revenge stories. I built a little crop farm, brought some water over, planted our first seeds, and added a few small touches around the house, including some proper stairs. It's nothing huge yet, but, you know, the place is slowly starting to feel a little more lived in. I really hope you enjoyed this shorter revenge episode. If you did, feel free to leave a like, subscribe, or let me know which story was your favorite. I always love reading your comments. Thanks for hanging out with me. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.